And I'm going to be turning it over now to Representative Ken Ivory from the state of Utah. And Ken and I got to know each other at the Arizona Planning Convention that Ken referred to earlier. And it was a great experience for me. I'm a former state senator from Iowa, and I attended there as a representative from the state of Iowa. And even though we worked on rules and it was specific for one particular topic, I left that gathering of 19 states, 75 of our colleagues from across the country, and I came back and said, I've got to do everything in my power to get states meeting together in convention. And that's what I've been doing since 2017, and all the different things, the coalition that we've worked on. That's how I got to know Sam and engaging the folks at Wolf-PAC and the other groups that are out there advocating. We truly want states to step up to the plate and reclaim that place at the table in our compound republic, that states have an equal say with the national government, and that's what we're trying to do. So Ken is going to be moderating us through. Ken Ivory, a state rep from the state of Utah. Ken served, he's kind of on a second round of serving the legislature. He served for a number of years in the Utah legislature, stepped away from into a private sector, and then had the calling that he can do more for the country by being an incumbent legislator. So he stepped back in, also has a law practice. He's also an adjunct professor at Utah Valley University, and there's some great things on federalism that Utah Valley University is doing that that Ken will share, and things like that we can get out to you folks in terms of understanding. Probably the most important thing that I find of the work that Ken Ivory has done over the years is he's an author of a book, Where's the Line? How States Protect the Constitution. And that's what Academy 3.0 is about. That's what this whole movement is about, is how do states protect the Constitution? They've got a role in it. We need the states involved. Ken?
Neil, thank you very much. Neil has been a champion for how we restore balance in our nation and how we move forward into something that we can create an even more perfect union for the next 250 years. You know, there's a Chinese proverb, a Chinese statement that says, may you live in interesting times. And I don't think it was meant as a compliment. And I think we all know that we are living in interesting times. Surveys show that 85% of the American people are not happy with how their government is operating. And yet this was a government to be managed of, by, and for the people. And every time we turn around, there are people that are not happy. They're not satisfied with how their government is working for them. On the flip side of that, we have Ronald Reagan and John F. Kennedy that have said things like, this is a wonderful time to be alive. We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times, and ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And certainly I think they were looking at these kinds of moments, what we can do, and it's clearly time that we step up and that we take a role in the government of the people, by the people, for the people, and look at the tools that we have to do that. We've had a history coming to this place now. A year ago in July of 2021, we had Academy 1.0 in Salt Lake City, where we looked at experts around the nation talking about what is this Article 5 and how do we do Article 5? How do state legislators speak for the people, and look at the tools in the Constitution to restore the balance, to restore that diversity and union that the Constitution was meant to preserve, was meant to establish. In December, we had Academy 2.0 in San Diego, and we brought people from across the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, to look at how states come together and use these constitutional tools to start restoring that constitutional balance. And when you look at America, what happens in America, we have something absolutely unique. In fact, it was revolutionary. The people are sovereign. That didn't exist anywhere else in the world, and it still doesn't exist. The people are sovereign. We're a nation of kings and queens. We're a nation of self-governing citizens, and that's what the Constitution was meant to establish. The Constitution was meant to secure the rights of the people. Government exists to secure the rights of the people. And if you think about what our Constitution does, I tease people often that I can help them memorize the Constitution in 30 seconds or less. Are you ready for this? 4 words. If government, which government? The entire Constitution. If government, did the sovereign people, where all the power resides, did they delegate the matter to government? There's a lot of things that we didn't. Who we associate with, what we believe, our religious perspectives, speech, we didn't delegate those things to any government. The people didn't delegate those. So if government, there are a lot of things that the people said no. But the second question is, if government, which government? And which government matters. And the whole Constitution then is about which government. If it was delegated to government, was it delegated to a government farther away, that by definition is less transparent and less accountable, but it is more powerful? Or was it reserved to a government closer to the people, where it's more accountable, more transparent, and it preserves the diversity of unique communities? And that was the genius of the Constitution. If we delegated it to government, which government did we delegate it to? And over time, that balance was critical to securing the rights of the people. We delegated few and defined things to the government far away. We reserved numerous and indefinite things to the government close to us so that our governing voice mattered. We can go to the State House. If there's a problem, we can work with a representative. We can take these things in and we can make changes. So in looking at which government, it was crucial. So that balance was essential. And then George Washington, in his farewell address, he said, if the distribution or modification of the governing powers was ever in any particular wrong, if that balance was in any particular wrong, let it be changed by an amendment, the way the Constitution designates. Don't let it be changed by usurpation. That's how free governments are destroyed. So in the Constitution, the tools in the Constitution, Article 5, one of 7 articles of the Constitution, says, 2/3 of Congress, of each House of Congress, can propose amendments, which, if ratified by 3/4 of the states, become a binding part of the Constitution. And then it provides another method. George Mason, on one of the last few days of the Constitution, said, well, if Congress or Washington is the problem, they're never going to curb themselves and restore balance on themselves. And so they gave the power to the states. Upon the application of 2/3 of the states, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. And Hamilton said that left nothing to question. It was a ministerial duty. It's mandatory. Congress shall call a convention. Upon the application of 2/3 of the states, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which still has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So could the states be the solution to these interesting times that we live in? Could Article 5 be the tool that states use to address these interesting times that we live in? We're here today to discuss this. We're here to discuss who would do that. How do they bring Article 5 together? Where would they do it? How would they do it? When would they do it? And why would they do it? And what if we don't? What if we keep doing the same thing over and over again and relying on Congress and Washington for different results? There was a very wise man once that said that was the definition of insanity. Clearly, we need to be looking at doing things differently if we expect different results. And so today we're going to have a rich discussion about these very things. We're first going to have a discussion with Sam Fieldman and Vickie Deppe. And Sam is a graduate of Fordham Law School. And Sam in law school decided that we could use law as a tool to create an even more perfect union. He worked for the Public Integrity Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office, particularly looking at the pay-to-play and the private equity type issues that were happening. When the Citizens United decision came out, Sam was extremely concerned about campaign finance and how might we fix the problems, and that's where Sam came acquainted with Article 5 and how that tool might be used to deal with the tremendous amount of money that affects the voice of the people in government. With that, Sam joined Wolf-PAC and has held many different positions with Wolf-PAC, currently as an independent contractor serves as National Counsel and on the Leadership Council of Wolf-PAC. We'll also hear from Vickie Deppe, and Vickie Deppe is the managing editor of the State Legislators Article 5 Caucus. This is a group of legislators around the nation that look at Article 5 as a tool that could be the tool that helps the states be the solutions to the issues facing our nation. Vickie is also the Director of Education for Path to Reform, and specifically, Vickie is passionate about bringing Republicans and Democrats together. Our problems are not left and right. They're not Republican and Democrat. They're not liberal and conservative. I would submit the biggest problems that face our nation are centralizing government farther away from the people, that's less accountable and less transparent, and self-government, that government closest to the people where their voice really matters. Vickie has been working tremendously diligently on that. She's a graduate of graduate of University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, also a master's degree from Wheaton College, and Vickie has the distinction of helping a number of states on the left and the right bring applications for Article 5 and getting sponsors from both parties. Vickie was involved with the Committee on the Assembly of State Legislators, a committee of legislators around the nation looking at drafting rules for how to convene an Article 5 convention. So with that, we are thrilled that it's time. We are in interesting times, and it is time for interesting solutions. We'll first hear from Sam Fieldman, and followed by Sam, we'll hear from Vickie Deppe, and we'll go to that point, and we'll be pleased to have your questions and move forward in the program. Sam Fieldman.
Hi, my name is Sam Fieldman. I'm National Counsel for Wolf-PAC. I've been with the organization for 10 years, since shortly before my kids were born. If you're not familiar with the organization, we seek to empower a mass movement to amend the U.S. Constitution, one that shatters the corrupting influence of money in politics and restores a democratic republic that represents us all. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about generally what is a constitutional convention, and how do we know how it'll work, and how do we know what are the sources of law that run behind Vickie's presentation later that get into the details of delegate selection and model language. How do we know that works? And if you disagree with something that's in the model language, how do you know where you can make a change and that change will be constitutionally valid? And we'll start with the most basic question: what is a constitutional convention? Constitutional means related to how things are constituted. Before we had a written constitution, that's basically what it meant. Even in England still today, when they talk about constitutional law, they don't have a written constitution. That's what they're studying, is just how the government is constituted. The term also, when talking about constitutional conventions, we often talk about it as something authorized by a written constitution. And then, of course, the term convention, just straight from the dictionary, is an assembly meeting for a common purpose. And I'm going to, when we talk about different kinds of constitutional conventions, you know, there are some instances where we use the first definition and some where we use the second, and then there's many types of constitutional conventions even within each of those. And that's what has led many people in the last 10 years or so to start trying to use alternate terms. Article 5 convention, Convention of States is a popular one that's used. The reason for that is to distinguish between these different types. I don't tend to do that, and the reason is, if you look back in scholarship, anytime before the last 10 years, and even pretty often still today, scholars just use the term constitutional convention for all of it, and then they distinguish within that between different types. And so for simplicity's sake, I tend to do the same thing, although I don't begrudge people who opt the other way. And looking at those scholars, the first one to really systematically and formally discuss what is a constitutional convention was Jameson in the middle of the 19th century. And he distinguished between revolutionary conventions, which go to the heart of the way the government functions and appeal directly to the people for their authority, versus amendatory conventions, which are more systematic and deal with changes to a system that are on a smaller basis. About 100 years ago, Hoare took a look at that and didn't really find that split to be super clean or work super well, and he suggested instead authorized versus popular versus spontaneous conventions. We're not going to talk about spontaneous conventions today. That's what typically happens if there is essentially no government and it needs to get started. Luckily, we're not in that position now. I think we should do our best to not get into that position. But we are going to talk about authorized and popular conventions. Authorized being ones that are provided for by some provision in the Constitution, whereas popular are ones that arise from the people themselves without a specific authorization. And then Rob Natelson, more recently, has talked about federal conventions versus state conventions in his fantastic book, which I highly recommend, and we're going to make an excerpt from it available. He focuses very heavily on federal conventions, which are instances where groups of different states come and meet together. And that's a very useful precedent when thinking about the rules that arise when different states meet together, how many delegates there are, how they handle voting, that kind of thing. It's a really good precedent for that. But there's a lot of things that it's not such a good precedent for, and that's why in this talk I'm going to focus more on the state conventions that I think Professor Natelson doesn't pay enough attention to. And you can read his book, and I highly recommend it for the federal conventions, but we're going to talk mainly about some federal conventions, but also state conventions that he doesn't get into as much. When you look at Article 5 itself, it's an authorized convention. It's an amendatory convention, and it's also a federal convention. And when people say there's no precedent for an Article 5 convention, well, we've never had an Article 5. First of all, there's two different kinds of conventions in Article 5 alone. There's an Article 5 convention for proposing amendments, and there's also another convention procedure in Article 5 for ratifying amendments, which we did in 1933 to ratify the 21st Amendment. There's also conventions under Article 7 of the Constitution to ratify the Constitution itself, which we'll also talk about. But when people say that there's no precedent for the Article 5 proposing convention, it's true that we've never had that specific convention before, but we do have a lot of experience with authorized conventions, and a lot of experience with the mandatory conventions, and a lot of experience with federal conventions, and we know the law that governs all of those. And because of that, we can tell and know and have quite a bit of precedent for how an Article 5 convention would work as well. And we're going to start by looking at a federal amendatory convention, and that was what happened in Annapolis, Maryland, before the Constitution was written. That was authorized by the state legislatures. At the time, they were under the Articles of Confederation. There is no convention procedure in the Articles of Confederation, so there was no way it could be authorized by the Articles. The state legislatures themselves sent delegates there, and they sent them there for a specific reason. They wanted to suggest economic amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And it was popular because there was no mechanism for that convention. It was just states wanting to send delegates to this federal convention for that discussion. After most of the states had written their delegate instructions, and before the convention itself, Shays' Rebellion happened, which was a big violent uprising in Massachusetts. The violence spilled over into New York, and it was clear that something bigger was going to be needed. And New Jersey appointed their delegates late enough that they were able to give a broader authorization to their delegates than the other states did. New Jersey said they wanted to effectually to provide for the exigencies of the Union. And they realized in Annapolis that that was the kind of thing that was really necessary. Economic amendments were not going to solve the problems that the country was having. But they also realized that they were bound by the instructions of the states that sent them there. And only New Jersey was authorized to do what needed to be done. So instead they wrote a report written by Alexander Hamilton to call for a new convention with broader authority of the kind that New Jersey had proposed. And that phrase, exigencies of the Union, was in most of the convention calls, all of them except New York and Massachusetts from the different states, when they then met in Philadelphia, called for a convention and authorized their delegates to deal with the exigencies of the Union. And those states were the ones who authorized to send their delegates. It was, again, a popular convention because because there is no convention procedure in the Articles of Confederation. It was revolutionary this time because of the incredibly broad authority given to the convention. And then there was also an invitation by Congress at that time. So even though there is no convention power in the Articles of Confederation, Congress decided that it would be useful for them to encourage this meeting. And they did debate it, and they did worry about it quite a bit. They were afraid of two things when they were debating about it. First, because there was no convention power in the Articles of Confederation, all they were really able to do was ask the convention to meet and advise Congress. It couldn't do anything on its own. And second, this was really led by the states who actually had authority to make changes. They were operating, as I said, under the Articles of Confederation at the time, and the Articles of Confederation were not like the Constitution. It was a treaty among sovereign states. The federal government, or the Confederate government at the time, was not a sovereign entity. The states were sovereign. So they were afraid that it would seem like the federal authority was usurping the power of the states. But they decided that it was worth doing and worth proposing that the states send delegates, and 12 of the 13 did. And yeah, as I said, the articles were a treaty among the sovereign states. And when it was time for ratification, the convention did exactly what it was instructed to do by Congress, which was send it not onto the states for ratification, but send it back to Congress because they only had advisory powers. Congress then sent the Constitution onto the states, and Congress had no real authority there either. And they debated that at the time. They questioned, should we do absolutely nothing because this isn't really our role? But they sent it on to the state, or they also wondered, should we instruct the states on what we think they should do? They ultimately decided their role was to just act as a messenger and send it on to the states with no further instruction to do with as they saw fit as sovereign, independent nation states. And that's precisely what they did. The Constitution itself called for ratification under, as I said before, Article 7, which is a separate convention procedure in the Constitution, specifically suggesting how it should be ratified. Almost all of the states followed that procedure. Rhode Island decided that they didn't want to, and they ended up not ratifying the Constitution at all for a while. They went so far as to accidentally become their own nation and send a letter to George Washington asking for good foreign relations before they ended up changing their mind and joining the country. But I'm going to talk about one of those Article 7 conventions in particular. The Article 7 conventions were authorized by the U.S. Constitution, although the U.S. Constitution had no real authority at that time because it hadn't been put into power yet. So they were mainly authorized by the several states that were using the procedure recommended by the U.S. Constitution. This is one of those instances where Hoare's criticism of Jameson's amendatory versus revolutionary thing doesn't work super well. I listed it as amendatory, but it's hard to say exactly where to categorize that. And they were state conventions meeting at the state level. The delegates to those conventions were selected by a vote, as were delegates to all of the conventions that have met under the U.S. Constitution, as opposed to the federal conventions that I mentioned earlier that were popular conventions not under the U.S. Constitution. Annapolis and Philadelphia, the delegates were appointed, which has generally been the case for the federal conventions. But they were appointed not just by voters, but by a broad popular vote. They expanded suffrage out in an unprecedented way in the United States at the time. They still didn't allow women to vote. They didn't allow people of color to vote. But they did allow people who didn't hold property, and that was highly unusual at the time. So it was pretty liberal for the time. And in many of the states, including in New Hampshire, the delegates received instructions directly from the people who they represent. That wasn't true in every state, but in I think close to half the states, they had some delegates who had specifically been instructed. And that ended up being extremely important in New Hampshire because the Constitution was not terribly popular in that state. They were worried that it wouldn't get ratified. They actually tried every dirty trick they could pull and met in a heavily Federalist-controlled area in the middle of a harsh New Hampshire winter, with some people having to travel over 200 miles, right near the Capitol where the Federalists would be. Those tricks didn't work, because even in the day when the information superhighway was the Pony Express, this was a big deal, and people took it seriously and sent delegates, and they instructed them to vote no. So when they met in convention, they realized that even once they convinced the delegates that the Constitution was actually a pretty good idea, and they wanted to vote yes, they couldn't, because they were bound by their instructions. So they adjourned the convention temporarily, sent their delegates 200 miles through a harsh New Hampshire winter on horseback back to their constituents to convince them to change their instructions. And the town of Boscawen, New Hampshire, had a particularly interesting story that is better preserved in the records than most of them are, where their delegates said, I really think the Constitution is a good thing. I realize that most of you disagree with me. If you send me there to vote with instructions that I have to vote no, I'm going to violate those instructions. So he gave an ultimatum. You've got two choices. You can either send me there with no instructions and let me vote the way I'm telling you I will, which is to vote yes, or you can not send me there at all. They had another candidate all picked out who was ready, willing, and able to go in his place. They recognized their authority to enforce their instructions through replacing their delegate with somebody else, and they ultimately decided that, based on the opinions of the town, when they held the vote, they decided that they would send him back without the instructions so that he could vote his conscience. And that's not because they didn't have any choice in the matter. It's because, recognizing that they had the power to enforce their instructions, they opted in this case that this would be the better way to go. And with that brings me to Hamilton had a Pony Express rider waiting at the convention in New Hampshire because he knew how monumentous this was going to be for the 9th state to pass. That was the threshold to put the Constitution into effect. And that rider took that news as soon as New Hampshire passed as the 9th state and rode right down to Poughkeepsie, where they were meeting in convention in New York. Now, this is obviously the same kind of convention under Article 7. But the big debate before that Pony Express rider arrived was whether or not to hold a new revolutionary convention, to redo Philadelphia 2.0. You'll see a lot of quotes from this time period about the dangers of conventions. This is what they were talking about: the idea of having a new revolutionary convention instead of ratification. That's what Madison was afraid of. That's what Hamilton was afraid of, etc. But as soon as the Pony Express rider showed up, then suddenly the Constitution was now definitely going into effect. And there was this new tool in the Constitution, the Article 5 Amendment Proposing Convention, and that suddenly was what they were talking about instead. A letter was written by John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, and with a little bit of help from Alexander Hamilton, passed unanimously by the New York Convention, calling for the use of the Article 5 Proposing Convention for the first time ever. And the letter called for it to be limited specifically to those issues raised by the Article 7 conventions. That was a very long list. It was about 100 different things. James Madison did not want that convention to meet specifically because of what was on that list. It would go forward to alter the way Congress worked before Congress had a chance to meet. And he didn't want to see anybody alter Congress before Congress met other than Congress. He also particularly didn't like one of the most popular amendments on there, which was to limit the taxation provisions. And because of that, he ended up proposing the Bill of Rights himself. At the time, Madison wasn't sold on the idea that we needed any amendments right away. But in the wake of this effort, and with persuasion from Hamilton, who was still his friend for a little while at that point, among others, he was persuaded to propose the Bill of Rights, which was, a pretty good result for the first effort for Article 5 conventions. there were quite a few conventions that met in the 150 years or so between that and the ratification of the 21st Amendment in 1933. And Rob Natelson, in his excellent book, did we manage to get that printed out or no? Yes, Neil? Oh, okay. So Rob Natelson, I'm going to go a little over and Vickie's going to go a little under. Rob Natelson, in his excellent book, it outlined those precedents very well, and I encourage you to read that. But I'm going to focus on an area that he did not focus on as much, which was the use of Article 5 ratification conventions. They were authorized directly in the U.S. Constitution. Congress, under its authority in Article 5, submits to the states the method of ratification, and it went with the convention method for the first and only time in its history. And then 43 of the states passed laws. Some of them looked at the idea that Congress would pass a law that would supersede it, and they allowed for that fact. But Congress didn't get its act together then, and probably won't anytime soon either. So the states themselves passed laws for running conventions. A lot of people were worried because it was the first time that was going to happen. But they had state conventions many times. They'd had over 200 already by this point in 1933. Had many in the 90 years since. So they knew how to do it. The delegates were selected again by broad popular vote. In almost every state, that's how the delegates were selected, as well as all of the states under the Article 7 conventions. Vickie's going to tell you about the model legislation, which includes appointment, which is generally how it's been done for the federal conventions, which were not authorized by any particular provision of law. Conventions that have been held directly under the U.S. Constitution have almost always had delegates appointed by popular vote. And either one is allowed, but that's my personal preference. But whatever different states want to do, I think is fine, and different states can disagree. And the delegates got their instructions directly from the people. It generally worked by having the candidates listed. Different states did it different ways. But for the most part, candidates were listed by how they promised to vote, and then people voted for the candidate that agreed with their position, and that's who ended up at the convention. The reason why Arizona is mentioned up there specifically is because they had a very interesting enforcement provision that we didn't see in any of the other states. In Arizona, in what seemed like what would have been inspired by Boscawen, but I don't think they actually knew about it. They had a provision where if you voted against your pledge, your vote would be invalidated, you would be removed from office, and you would be replaced with an alternate who would vote the way they were promised. What this effectively did is it made a runaway not just illegal, not just improbable, not just immoral, it made it impossible. You could not vote against the way you promised, because if you did, your vote would be invalid. And we saw that same idea come to play with whether you not want to call this a convention. It certainly breaks down some of the categorizations, but I think it is a useful and relevant precedent, the Electoral College. I listed it as authorized, a mandatory, federal. I think this is one of the weaknesses between the revolutionary versus a mandatory distinction. It's not really either. But it's authorized by the U.S. Constitution, and the states have statutes that dictate how they go about regulating their electoral college procedure. There's U.S. law governing it as well. And delegates are selected by broad popular vote. The president isn't. The president is selected by the Electoral College. But the electors to the Electoral College are selected by popular vote within each state. Their instructions are so important that in almost every, maybe even every, I'm not sure, state, their names don't even appear on the ballot. You have to go look them up at the Secretary of State's website. What appears on the ballot is who they're promising to vote for, and you vote for the promise, you don't even vote for the individuals. And the enforcement mechanism is also there. There was a Supreme Court case in 2020 that dealt with runaway electors in Washington and Colorado. Washington had a legislation that made it against the law to be a runaway elector and had a fine for that. But in Colorado, there was not a runaway elector. There was an attempted runaway elector. Because here in Colorado, they adopted the exact same provision, that came from Arizona in their Article 5 ratification convention, where the delegate who didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton, voted for somebody else. That delegate had their vote invalidated, and they were replaced by an alternate whose vote was ultimately counted when the Congress met in a joint session in 2016. It was the alternate delegate whose vote was counted. And that scheme was upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court in 2020. This is a highly controversial, very divided Supreme Court that a lot of people don't trust. But even this court unanimously, just recently, with almost all of the same members, upheld this exact method of enforcement. Now I'm going to talk about one more convention real quick, and that's the state convention. Most state conventions are unlimited, and I think that's just a function of the way states work. States aren't made up of towns and cities that can propose a limited idea the same way the federal government is made up of states. But there is an exception. There have been a number of states that have had limited conventions, and there was a study almost 100 years ago that explored how well those have worked. But there's one recent example that has demonstrated quite well, which is Florida. They have a convention every 10 years, and it alternates between an unlimited one and a limited one specific on budget issues. The last one of those was in 2008, and the delegates were instructed directly by the constitutional provisions. And in that case, in 2008, they believed that they were doing what was authorized, but some people disagreed. There was a reasonable dispute about whether or not some of the provisions that they were proposing as amendments were within the scope of budgetary issues, and it went to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court said, these issues are within your limits, these ones aren't, those ones can go on to be ratified or not, these ones are not. The judiciary enforced the instructions. And so we can see as we turn back to the Article 5 amendatory convention and compare it to this precedent, its authorizing power is the states and the U.S. Constitution, as well as a call from Congress. Congress does have a role to play here. The delegates can be appointed or elected. Delegates can be instructed by the state legislatures. They also have some level of instruction directly from Congress, and whatever that call is that Congress makes that summarizes what the applications have been from the states, that is also part of the mandate that forms their instructions. And we can see roles to play, not all of which I went into, but most of which I did. Enforcement by the states, by the courts, by Congress, by delegates. I saw Mr. Stern's paper, which is available back there, goes into some of the enforcement mechanisms that I didn't talk about today. I highly encourage you to read that. And I just want to say one more very quick thing about elections. I'll be super quick with that. The single subject of a limited convention election is a powerful tool to help make sure you get the best delegates. We've seen in many states the minimum wage pass a referendum with a broad margin of error, where in that same election people voted for candidates who very much disagreed with the minimum wage. Because when you go issue by issue, you can find where people agree and disagree, as opposed to having people voted on across their range of opinions and their range of experiences. There's also a special protection in the movement that Wolf-PAC is calling for a convention on, where the issue is the corrupting influence of money in politics. When that happens, we've seen across the political spectrum, spending money on politics doesn't help as much as it does when that's not the issue in the campaign. We've seen that in the GOP primary when Ben Bratt beat Eric Cantor, who was then the #2 Republican in the House, because he campaigned on the issue of money in politics. We've seen that on the left when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez beat Crowley, who was then the #3 Democrat in the House, again on the same issue. And we saw that just this past November in a general election when Ed Durr, a truck driver who nobody had ever heard of, beat the New Jersey Senate president, again because people were focused on the corrupting influence of money and how that impacted Sweeney. And Sweeney's first action right after that election was to fight for the rescission of Wolf-PAC's resolution in New Jersey. So I'm happy to see he's no longer in that seat. I'm going to close with one picture that I think the two of you in the front row will recognize the location of. People talk about talk about these conventions as though they're ancient history, as though they don't happen. This is a picture of a convention held under Article 5 in Utah in 1933. That was the most recent time. It was broadcast on national radio. This was the day that Prohibition was repealed. And fortunately, thanks to that, we can all celebrate with a drink. Thank you. Vickie, go ahead.
Okay, so as we talked about earlier, I'm Vickie Deppe, and I started my Article 5 journey in Illinois in 2014 when I joined Convention of States Project as a legislative liaison. And during the 4 years that I was there, we built a bipartisan coalition that consisted of 56 members of the Illinois House. That's nearly half of them. And they were pretty much evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. The resolution was carried by a Democrat from Chicago, and we had leadership from both parties in that coalition. Before I left Illinois to move here to Colorado, we had secured an 8-0 do pass vote from the House Executive Committee and navigated 2 kill committees. So I tell you all that because a lot of people feel that the Article 5 issues are divisive and they're politicized. And I want to tell you that I know from firsthand experience that Republicans and Democrats can be brought together to impose reforms on Washington when they won't do it themselves. So I really appreciate you being here. And we're going to talk, I'm going to talk about delegate selection through legislative appointment, and then Mike and Dave are going to talk about instruction and oversight. So when last I checked, 14 states had some kind of delegate selection and instruction and oversight bundle of legislation, and they're all bundled into one piece. We decided to break this into a single or 3 separate pieces because your selection formula can be workable for any convention, any Article 5 convention. But instruction and oversight are almost certainly going to be specific to what the subject of the convention is. And so let's take a look and see why that's so. So first, let's think about a term limits convention. You may have strong bipartisan opposition to term limits in your legislature. And if that's the case, you're just going to send delegates, like Sam talked about, and tell them, vote no. You vote no on this. And so that's very cut and dried. But even if your legislators support term limits, the only real question is how long should they be? So that's still pretty straightforward, not complicated. But if you're sending a delegation to a Convention of States Project convention where you're limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, establishing fiscal controls, establishing term limits, that's very complex. And so the instructions that you give to your delegation will be much more involved. Or if we take Wolf-PAC, dealing with money and politics, that's narrower than the Convention of States Project, but it's still pretty open. How are you going to deal with that? And so it just depends how wide-ranging the convention is and how much agreement there is in your legislature, how many delegates you're going to want to choose. So I want to take an aside. Sam talked about the different things that conventions are called. I want to just take a side trip and tell you about delegates versus commissioners. You're probably going to hear some of the speakers today talk about commissioners, and that's because a commissioner is someone who has been given a commission to carry out, and that's what the instruction package that the legislature issues is called. I prefer delegate because a delegate acts on behalf of someone else, which is what the people at an Article 5 convention are doing, and it just seems like people have an intuitive grasp of that. But just know that if somebody calls somebody a commissioner, that's the same person I'm calling a delegate. So as we decide who we're going to send to this convention, I'm not gonna pour through model legislation with you. What I'm going to do is give you a series of questions that you'll want to go back to your legislature and sort through. And as you get answers to each of these questions, your delegate selection statute will begin to take place. So some of those questions are, how many? How many do we want to send? What will their qualifications be? Who can nominate a delegate? and who confirms the delegates. So let's first look at the question of how many. So again, if the convention matter is complex, you're going to want more delegates. If there's consensus in the legislature, you won't need as many delegates, but if there's division in your legislature about that, you'll need more delegates. Another question to consider is, do you want to include both parties in your delegation or input for both parties in your delegation? There are some states where their legislative rules require that. But even if they don't, I would suggest it's a good thing to consider for two reasons. One is, I think it will help take away the politicization of this process if there's strong bipartisan participation. And the other is, the more people we bring to the table in this conversation, the better the product of the convention will be. So, next question, do you want an odd number? When an Article 5 convention occurs, votes are taken on a one state, one vote basis. So you don't get more votes if you send more delegates. And your delegation will need to decide amongst themselves how that one vote will be cast. And so if there's an even number of delegates, then they're going to have to come up with some other way to break an impasse besides just voting amongst themselves. So, do you need to consider geography? I'm going to talk about my home state of Illinois. I lived there most of my life. So Nevada and Tennessee also have a geographic requirement, but let's look at Illinois. So you can see up here, that's Cook County. That's the county where Chicago is. And half of the population lives in this little part of the state. And then we have northern Illinois, and that's everything above Interstate 80. Then there's central Illinois, and this is Interstate 70. And then we have southern Illinois. So southern Illinois, when you think about it in terms of northern Illinois, the Chicago metropolitan area, it's like a whole other country. There's only 10% of the population of Illinois lives in this area, compared to half that live up here. The culture down here is much more like Indiana and Kentucky, and that's because as Europeans started settling this part of the country, they were following the Ohio River, and that brought them here from places like Virginia and Indiana and Kentucky. And so it's much more like the South than it is like the rest of Illinois. On the other hand, people who were coming to the Chicago area were coming this way across land, and they were coming from places like Pennsylvania and New York. So very culturally different, and those sensibilities persist to this day. So when you think about all these things, it becomes clear that if your delegates are all from the biggest city in your state or all from your capital, it's quite possible that some of your residents will feel disenfranchised. So that's something you want to give some thought to. So when I worked with the sponsor of our resolution to try and come up with a formula. And so what we did was we gave Cook County 3, Northern Illinois 2, and then Central and Southern Illinois each 1. But we wanted a 7-member delegation, and so what we did, we have a 7-member delegation. The Speaker appointed 2, the President appointed 2, then the ranking House member and the ranking Senate member were each asked to appoint 1, and then this is 6. So to get to the 7th, these 6 delegates chose the 7th delegate, and they had to have at least 4 votes. 4 of these people had to vote for that person to become the 7th delegate. Okay, so that's geographic considerations. Lastly, and probably shouldn't be last, is how many delegates can your state afford to send? And you'll want to remember that you're going to need to create support staff for them while they're participating in the convention, and you will want to have alternates for them so that if something happens like Sam talked about or somebody falls ill or something, you've got someone else that you can send. Okay, now we'll talk about qualifications, and I'd like to start with disqualifiers. So most states prohibit felons, person of unsound mind, lobbyists. Now that's a That's an interesting question because there's lobbyists that work at the state capitol and there's lobbyists that work in Washington, D.C. And your state might decide, you know, our guys are okay, it's just the Washington, D.C. people that we don't want. Or you may decide lobbyists are okay or no lobbyists are okay. So there's no right or wrong answer to that question. It's just what you think is good for your state. Another class of people that you want to think about is federal office holders and federal employees. A lot of folks think that there's a conflict of interest there. And lastly, non-residents. So at first glance, it would probably seem apparent that you would want somebody who lives in your state to represent your state, but let's say you had your speaker just retired and moved out of state to be closer to grandchildren. And this person is really well-liked, respected, capable, popular on both sides of the aisle and with the populace. Do you want to make a way for that person to represent your state at a convention, or do you just want to say, we need to move on, they're not here anymore, and keep it to residents? So again, no right or wrong answers, just things to think about. Okay, so the biggest qualification I think you need to decide about is, do you want to make your delegation completely comprised of sitting legislators? There are pros and cons to that. The consensus in many states is, well, if you're going to be representing us, you should be one of us. And certainly, there's no one who understands the mind and sensibility of a legislature than one of its own members. But there's some downsides to that too. The first one is you could have schedule conflicts. There may be a time when, if you're a sitting legislator on a delegation, you may have to miss either the convention or be absent from session. Another downside is term limits and retirement. If, for example, Arizona's delegate selection statute says the delegate has to be a sitting legislator not just when they're appointed, but through the duration of the convention. And so if they're going to get term limited out, you don't want to pick them because then you'll have to replace them. If they're going to retire, then you have to replace them. So that's another disadvantage. Also, if your legislature meets year-round, you're more likely to have those schedule conflicts. And the last con is that it eliminates your ability to tap subject matter experts in your delegation. So let's say you have some really top drawer universities in your state and you wanted to tap a constitutional scholar or an economist for a spending controls convention for a delegate. If they can only be sitting legislators, I'm doing what you're doing, Neil, then you wouldn't be able to use them. So that's a reason to maybe not limit your delegation. Now, who can nominate them? So you could open this up to constituents, to the public at large, and the advantage to this is they may connect you to somebody who would make an excellent delegate that you might not have considered otherwise. But the downside, there's always a downside to every decision that you make about this, and the downside to the public at large being able to nominate delegates is that you may draw attention and controversy to this process that you don't want. So you could allow any member of your legislature to nominate a delegate, and that's cast a pretty broad net because the legislatures across America have hundreds of members, and so you'll get plenty of nominees, plus your members can anticipate the confirmation prospects of the people that they nominate. Another way to do this is with an ad hoc committee. And the ad hoc committee could make the nominations themselves, or they could be responsible for creating a process to field the nominations from the members or the constituents. Another way to nominate is have your leadership do it. And if your delegates are going to be all sitting legislators, this is going to be the most streamlined way to do it. But I want to point out that you may be under time pressure when this happens. And the reason for that is a resolution has been filed in Congress demanding that they call a balanced budget amendment convention, a fiscal controls convention, based on the 34 or more BBA apps that were enforced between 1979 and 2001, and again between 2015 and 2021. And so there they are. And then the resolution says, once this resolution has passed and the archivist has counted them up, you get 6 months before the convention has to happen. And so this thing's coming at you like a freight train. And I think that it would behoove you to make this a legislative priority. So even if this specific resolution doesn't pass, I think it's fair to say that the next call, whenever it happens, is going to be structured very much like this. And so what we need to remember is that Congress is in session year-round. And so this thing could pop at any time. State legislatures, most of them, are only in session from January to May or thereabouts. So there's a decent chance that you may be gavelled out for the year when this thing happens. And so there's a couple of ways to think about that. In Alaska, their statute created an ad hoc committee that could meet year-round, even if the legislature wasn't in session. In Florida, they have one process for if the legislative session is underway, and a different process if it's not. So there's different ways to handle that, but it's good to know that this is a situation you could find yourself in. Now, vetting and confirmation. And again, same players, just what role do you want them to have? The ad hoc committee might do that. You might make that a prerogative of leadership. You can put the candidates to a vote in the House and the Senate, or you could do it in a joint session, and you could give them that to leadership, and then give them. You can mix and match. You can do the committee, then a joint session. You can do leadership, then take it to a vote of each chamber. Or you could just let leadership do it. Okay, so I have peppered you with a lot of questions, and I want to wrap up with just a little word of encouragement. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. We are building a database at Path to Reform that it will be live by the time you get home from NCSL that has all this legislation, so you can look at what they have done and model yours after it. And something that doesn't get a great deal of attention in our country is the ability of states to form interstate compacts. Every state in the country is a member of an interstate compact. And a lot of them have formed commissions where the state sends people to go as commissioners and represent the state. And so you can look at the legislation that drives how you choose those commissioners and model your Article 5 legislation after that. There's also the Uniform Law Commission. The Uniform Law Commission has been meeting since 1892 to draft model legislations for states. And every state in the union has a commission that goes there. So find out how your state chooses those commissioners, model your legislation after that. And lastly, take advantage of your Legislative Research Bureau. That's what they're there for. And like I said, I encourage you to really give this attention when you get back to your legislature. Even if you oppose an Article 5 convention, there's one on the near horizon, and you want to be ready, even if it's just to show up and say, no, we don't want this, but you want to be ready to do that. Okay, and I think I'll invite Sam back up for questions.
All right, Vickie, Sam, thank you so very much. I want to give them a round of applause. I feel like I knew a great deal about Article 5, and you both just opened my eyes to so many different things. Thank you very, very much. So a couple of questions. If you would both speak to, both Sam, on the type of convention. You went through a number of things on the type of convention. And then Vickie, you talked about in delegate selection and these sorts of things. Would you both speak to those different aspects on how that may help to safeguard how you might keep a convention limited, how you might keep a convention in control? So kind of a single question that goes to the two different things you spoke about. So Sam on even the type of convention and Vickie on the selection process. How does that keep things within the guardrails?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've seen a lot of conventions that are comparable to the Article 5 proposing convention in various ways, and we can then compare what is and is not a mechanism that we've seen enforced that actually is comparable in the right way. That's why we've seen the courts in action in enforcing the limitations in Florida at the state level and in the Electoral College case. We've seen Congress getting involved in in exploring whether or not convention calls have been sufficient to be counted. We've seen them explore that a couple of times in their history and write reports. And we've seen the states decide whether or not to ratify various things at times. And we've also seen the states specifically enforcing instructions, writing instructions, all in very comparable circumstances to Article 5. So that's why when people say that the only precedent is the 1787 convention, that's not even a very good precedent. That was a very different kind of convention. And we've gotten much better precedent that is much more comparable, that demonstrates all of these mechanisms at work.
And I would just remind, if you have questions, you want to pass those up while we're going, please feel free to do so. Vickie, so yeah, in the type of the delegate selection process and the things that are happening you went into, and great information, by the way, how does that process and that selection process help to maybe keep a convention going the right direction from maybe going out of control? Some have that kind of fear. How would you answer questions like that based purely on that kind of delegate selection criteria and process you spoke about?
Sure. Well, I think that we all talk about that the states can recall a member of their delegation if they violate their instructions. But what this shows is that the states are not only in control of that, they're in control of who goes in the first place, and they're in control of how those people are selected. So the states are in control every step of the way.
And then specifically with respect to the delegate selection requirements and models, how would someone know if their state currently has something or not, and where to look? How do they go into this detail on what their state may or may not have done already?
They can visit pathtoreform.org, and we'll have a database there next week.
Great, thank you. I kind of figured you might have an answer like that. Sam, so in what you've talked about with the various types of conventions, when we're looking at this, and Vickie mentioned the HCR 101, and there's a lot of things in play. I mean, we could see with the kind of times that we're in, we could go a number of different directions. The timing, just in the duration of a convention, Vickie mentioned about is a delegate able to be available? What are we looking at on the time? How long might a convention take?
Well, we've seen a pretty wide variety over the years. I haven't looked specifically. The best example to look at is probably some state conventions like the one in Florida that's limited. But I haven't looked into specifically how long some of those take. It really depends, like Vickie pointed out, on the level of complexity of the question. The conventions for ratifying the 21st Amendment in Delaware took 45 minutes, but that was a really simple question. So probably longer than that, depending on the subject matter.
All right, great. And then Vickie, what's the default? If a state doesn't have something on the books, and let's suppose HCR 101 just happens to go through right away, and we're on this 6-month clock, what is the default if a state doesn't have a delegate selection process?
Legislative leadership may authorize delegates.
And that would be where they would fall, okay? I just want to ask you, do you have questions for each other?
We talk enough that I don't think I do.
Is there anything that you heard or that you heard from each other, anything that we didn't get into that you'd like to address?
There was one thing that I just wanted to point out. In the unlikely event that Congress gets its act together to pass legislation, the regulations that they've looked at in the past, and it's had supporters from Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Orrin Hatch, many people across the political spectrum, some of whom are in important positions now, have supported regulations at the congressional level. They tend to favor elections, and they tend to favor elections by electoral district, and they tend to favor one person, one vote. And the significant majority of scholars think that that would be allowed. I don't think it's likely that Congress is going to pass much of anything, in which case it would be left to the states with the kinds of things that Vickie was talking about to choose how they want to do that. And even if Congress does pass things, there are still many questions like the instructions and the enforcement of those instructions. Similar to the Electoral College, where there is federal law, states still have a lot of room to pass their own thing on top of that.
You know, I think what I took from both of you in your discussion, a lot of times people say, we just don't know. We just don't know what this would look like, and we don't know how this would operate. If you could both just kind of recap and speak to that, when people say we have no idea how this would operate, both from a convention type, from a delegate selection process, would you speak to what states are doing already, how we've done conventions and convention type things already, and just maybe as a recap, address that question that we hear so often?
I mean, I think my favorite way to address it is the picture that you saw of your where you work, holding a convention. This is not something that is foreign to the states, both under the Constitution directly as well as state conventions. I saw a count from about 100 years ago that said that we had over 200 state conventions by then. I don't know what the current number is now, but it's considerably higher.
All right, Vickie, what do you say to that? We just don't know how to pick delegates. We just don't know how to do this.
Well, we've done it many, many times in the past, and I like to point, when I was working the Illinois State Legislature, to the MEET convention, where Midwestern states had an interstate convention. It ran perfect, and it became the basis of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is still in force today. Here in Colorado, we had the Colorado River Commission, and that was in 1922, I believe, created a compact between these western states, us, Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And that compact is still in force. We still send commissioners to that. It runs without a hitch.
I didn't know that was where the Sherman Act came from. It's one of my favorite laws.
Yeah.
You know, and I like that you brought up the Uniform Law Commission, and then things like NCSL and other CSG and ALEC, these groups of conferences of legislators. These are, and then particularly the Uniform Law Commission. We're in essence having a convention of states frequently. I mean, all the time. We've got legislators getting together, and there are rules of procedure and things that way. I really want to thank you. I learned a great deal. I thought this was incredibly informative. Again, as Vickie pointed out and as Sam pointed out, there are resources. You can go to pathtoreform.com.
Yep, right. Org.
Pathtoreform.org. There'll be more information about this. Sam, I'm assuming your slides will be available on that?
Yeah, I can make the slides available. I'm also going to make the chapter from Nadelson's book, if I can, available on the website. And I've got a 2-page introduction that explains why I agree and disagree as well on that, which more or less argues what I showed in my slides.
Well, let's thank these two one more time. And
Thank you.